Thank you. Bear with me one moment, please, while I share my screen and just make sure that everyone can see the PowerPoint slides all right. Jenny, are they looking okay?
Looks great.
Oh, great. Well, as I just mentioned, to reiterate, I just wanted to ask everyone to please hold your questions till the end, but feel free to put them in the chat. This is absolutely a neurodivergent safe space, as are, all the presentations that I do. So it's completely okay if you need to stand up, walk around. If you want to fidget with your hands, that's totally fine. I know I see pretty much everyone's cameras are off, but feel free to turn them on if you like or not. Everything is welcome here. Okay, so today we are here to talk about ADHD and suicide, and specifically some positive ways to support folks who might be, who care about, who are experiencing both ADHD and suicide risk. My slides are working. Just to introduce ourselves, my name is Elle O'Flaherty. I'm an ADHD and executive coach. My focus is working with the ADHD community. I'm particularly interested in mental health as it relates to ADHD, and of course, executive function and productivity. In my former life, I was an attorney until I suddenly became awake and realized that it was very ill-suited to my brain wiring.
And I'm Jenny Cureton. I'm an associate professor of counselor education and supervision at Kent State University. And so I'm a licensed professional counselor in Texas and Colorado. My focus of practice as well as research is on that maybe strange intersection for some between trauma and crisis and career. That's where I love to live. And I say that I'm a writer of the boring kind because when people ask me what I love most about my work, I say writing, and then they think that what I mean is like that I'm a poet or that I'm a beautiful novelist, but no, I just write research papers and training manuals and very boring things.
For the record, I bet you could be a poet if you wanted to. Thanks, Jenny. So today we're going to talk a little bit about our goals. And first, I'm going to give you a little ADHD overview, talk about why there are heightened concerns when it comes to ADHD and suicide. And then some of those specific concerns and how they play out in this space. Then Jenny is going to tell you about some of the tools for prevention, including a model that a mnemonic model that she created called SHORES. All right, so to get started, it's interesting because I do work with so many people in this population and folks who are their loved ones and supporters. And even people in our own community tend not to know that much about ADHD. I will say the last 5 years have really been a renaissance in what we've learned and the research that's come out on ADHD. So things are changing all the time as well. But here's a little primer on it. So what is ADHD? Well, ADHD is a difference in brain structure. It impacts norepinephrine and dopamine uptake. It is something that impacts many areas, including focus and executive function. The best way I've ever heard it described is by one of the main researchers on ADHD, Ned Hallowell. He says that it's a Ferrari brain with bicycle brakes, and I find that to be quite true. And the other main difference that we'll talk about today is a difference in focus. I think the name ADHD is really not that great because it's not that we lack attention and an ability to focus. It's that neurotypical folks can prioritize tasks based on importance. So deadlines, importance to them, importance to their loved ones, bosses. ADHD folks essentially do not have that ability. We prioritize tasks based on interest. And so our focus is pretty much entirely interest driven. So it's a really different way of approaching the world. I will say that throughout all of human evolution, the gene that we believe is responsible for ADHD has been positively selected. And there's this really interesting NIH study where they did a little modeling on early human groups, and they saw that a small percentage of the population who have ADHD traits like lower or higher risk tolerance, creativity, openness to innovation and to spread ideas, that it is a critical piece of for human survival. So up until the Industrial Revolution, we were doing great. And then folks wanted us to sit in cubicles and sit still and be quiet. And that's when the wheels fell off a bit for many of us. So let's first talk about the three different types. There is no ADD. ADD is gone. It's no longer in the DSM. Now there is an ADHD umbrella under which three different subtypes exist. The first one is the inattentive type. These are your daydreamers, your folks who might be thinking about something else and don't even hear what you say. This is often characterized by forgetfulness, lack of attention to details, and inattention. It's more common in girls and adults. The second type is hyperactive impulse type. These are more common, this type is more common in children and men. It's seen as neurotypical people put it, excess energy. It's normal for us. And sometimes a lack of self-control. And then finally, the third type is combination. Oh, hi, it's me. And that's a mixture of both inattention and hyperactive and impulse control. Now, very well-meaning doctors, psychiatrists, parents, all sorts of folks will really, go hard on how do we overcome this? How can we cure it? All these sorts of things. I just see it as a difference in brain wiring, and I do not see it as a bad thing. In fact, we have many superpowers that, if harnessed correctly, and if we have tools to sort of cope in a neurotypical world, we can be incredibly productive. In fact, the average ADHD person is 300% more likely to become an entrepreneur. And we are significantly overrepresented in the highest ranks of startups, of innovative type companies. And so that's kind of an interesting thing as far as where this path can lead us. We're also really known for humor and creativity. We're known for passion and being very empathetic. We tend to be very imaginative, which helps us with problem solving. The way I describe it is we don't see the tree, we don't see the forest, but we see the forest and the field behind it and the ocean and the moon, which then helps us make connections that are really great for problem solving. And one of the main superpowers that is pretty amazing and is a little difficult to describe to neurotypical people is hyperfocus. And that is when we are really interested in something, our entire world goes down to working on that thing or doing whatever that thing is. Just as an example, I love putting together PowerPoint presentations. And so when I was working on these slides, I sat at my desk continuously for basically hours, not really noticing the time going by, to the point that we won't drink water, we won't eat meals. So it's really interesting, the superpowers that come with this, and the kind of productivity that you can have in hyperfocus is unbelievable. Now, I will say that there are definitely some differences, such as our executive function skills. You can see here, there are many ways to cut executive function, and people haven't exactly landed on the specific buckets, but this is a pretty common one with 8 areas. You'll notice that overall, many of these areas include self-control, like self-regulation, impulse control, self-monitoring, things like impulse control as well. It also involves emotions. ADHD has a significant impact on our emotions. Essentially, most ADHD people experience heightened emotions. So our emotions are bigger, essentially, than neurotypical folks. And sometimes this can lead to difficulty with controlling our emotions. It can also lead to some differences when it comes to social interactions. So something to be aware of. We also do tend to have some deficiencies in working memory, especially short-term, taking our working memory into short-term and long-term memory. That is very much exacerbated when we are when we're focused on something else. Then we get to no memory for many of us. And other things, again, like task initiation, organization, all that good stuff. The problem is that these are highly noticeable, especially to parents and teachers. The average ADHD child, by the time they're 14, has received 20,000 additional negative messages about themselves. That's a lot of negativity coming each person's way. often parents will, pick up on the lack of organization, trouble finishing tasks, including homework, things like that. They'll make comparisons with other siblings, or teachers will compare to other students. Their expectations will be for what a neurotypical child would typically do. Um, Sometimes kids will end up deflecting through humor. Sometimes they'll have negative emotional reactions and feel rejection as a result. Um, the consequences are often that there will develop a sensitivity to criticism, as well as some folks have rejection sensitivity disorder. That's pretty common in the ADHD community. In order to avoid this, we tend to do a lot of masking. We try to change, which then many ADHD people will either take that feeling inside and assume that there's something terribly wrong with them because they don't operate like neurotypical people, or they will push it to the outside, and that's when you start seeing some anger issues. Um, and a lot of this is because of the misunderstanding of how we operate and what you can expect from us. So supporters of ADHD folks understanding it better is really a huge support for folks in our community. I will also say it's very common to have comorbidities, which I hate that word. It just sounds so terrible, but comorbidities with ADHD. And newer studies are showing that it's likely somewhere around 80% of us, maybe even more. And things like anxiety and depression, you can see on this wheel sort of the different things. This doesn't have substance use disorders, but that's also very common in our community. So this can be, just something to keep in mind. One of the most recent studies that I saw was as high as 89%. So really common, very typical. How this comes into play with ADHD and suicide is ADHD folks have a 600 to 1,000% increased risk of suicidal ideation and activity. There's a strong correlation regardless of whether or not comorbidities are present. And so in order to prevent suicide, we need to address ADHD, both in the messages that ADHD people are receiving, in their understanding of their own brain wiring, and also in helping them develop skills so that they can interact in a neurotypical world while also really, valuing their own strengths. Now, here are some of the ADHD specific suicide factors. This came out of a Berkeley girls with ADHD study. It was very interesting as far as showing that combined type ADHD has a heightened risk. For instance, one of the key ages where there's a heightened risk is in early adolescence, and that's 11 to 14. Some of the things that contribute to this are our, higher threshold for risk taking. Sometimes, as I said, when people have decided to do when they've not decided, but when there are anger or other emotions going on, that there can be aggression. Childhood abuse, of course, contributes. Then some of the compounding factors to be aware of is, for instance, the stigma around ADHD. Still, only about 20% of the folks we believe who have ADHD have been diagnosed in this country. People are often not going to get a diagnosis because they consider it to be shameful to have ADHD. There's a lot of stigma around the medications involved with ADHD. And frankly, even as an ADHD coach, I advise my clients not to disclose at work because people kind of tend to pigeonhole and see this as a really negative thing. Also, some other things that can be compounding factors. ADHD people tend not to be, our brains are whirring, which means that we tend not to be in our body as much, in the sense that we might not notice our emotions or be used to naming and parsing those out. We also may not notice our physical body. And for many of us, that comes as a very high pain threshold because we don't notice when we're in physical pain. For some people, I think probably a minority of ADHD folks, that presents as increased pain sensitivity because they are constantly attuned to it, but not really, coming to their full conscious. Also, as I said, when we get really engrossed or when our executive function is off, we can tend to forget about self-care, down to drinking water, realizing they need to go to the bathroom on time, things like that. And again, substance use disorders is unfortunately pretty rampant in our, well, not rampant, but it's associated in our community. Now, the critical challenges when it comes to suicide prevention and trying to help folks in this population is we tend to get pretty easily overwhelmed and frustrated, and which then leads to hopelessness and paralysis. So when ADHD people, for instance, are procrastinating, which is very common, that is often created by overwhelm or frustration and having trouble figuring out, which steps to put in which order. So that paralysis can make things pretty challenging. We also tend to have extremely negative self-talk. As I said, many of us, if not most of us, have turned all these negative messages inside. And so we tend to have a voice in our head that tells us often we're lazy, we're irresponsible, we're not that smart. And we also are predisposed to a higher negativity bias than neurotypical folks. So that means that all humans remember that thing they said 5 years ago, they shouldn't have said, and at 2 a.m. when they can't sleep, there it is. ADHD folks even more so. And so we tend to really latch on to every negative thing or thing we perceive as negative that we've done. However, our brains are complete Teflon when it comes to some of our wins. So we don't remember many of our achievements. We don't remember the compliments, things like that from 3 days ago. But that thing we said 3 years ago, it's top of mind. So that's also difficult because we don't retain the positive memories as well. And when it comes to memory, we also have trouble with identifying our strengths and remembering those. So helping ADHD people to see some of their unique strengths and skills and to recognize them can be very powerful. I mentioned earlier that there is there is a stigma around medication. I assume it's because of that they are stimulants, and of course, some of these are illegal for most folks in this country. But stimulant medication has been seen to significantly reduce the likelihood of suicidal activity or ideation. In a sample of almost 4 million patients with ADHD, you can see here on the left-hand side that it reduced the risk of this kind of activity by 31%. It didn't matter, and longer treatment with stimulants heightened the effect. It didn't work with non-stimulants. Many folks take non-stimulants. It doesn't have the same effect. It also seemed to decrease depressive events. Perhaps substance use disorders need a little more study on that. I will say the one negative is that it did increase some activity 3 months before and 3 months after the start of medication. That might be, some researchers have postulated that might be because by the time someone is ready to face ADHD and admit that they have it, it is often because they've hit basically rock bottom or are facing very significant challenges. So, Jenny, what do we do about it?
Thank you so much. So it's a pretty bleak picture that we've posed here, but remember back also to those strengths. So we're going to shift, our purpose here in some ways is to shift both the narrative about ADHD as well as the narrative about suicide conversations. And so we're going to speak with people who are not necessarily in a professional role with the people that they care about who may have ADHD. And also then at the end, we'll mention some things that professionals can do. So I'd like for us to think about the idea of suicide protective factors. So many of us have heard about suicide risk factors or suicide warning signs. And the idea about suicide protective factors is that unlike risk factors, which are things that are active in a person's life or a person's demographics or their surrounding community that make them more at risk for suicide, protective factors actually protect against suicide risk. And so unlike things like warning signs that we as people who care about members of the ADHD community might be listening for, like sounds of hopelessness in what they are saying, right? Or giving away a lot of their possessions, or like really been depressed for a long time, and then suddenly everything's just fine, right? So major mood changes. Protective factors actually operate by cushioning some of those risk factors, and they can even interrupt any kind of ideation turning into any thoughts about suicide, turning into actually attempting suicide. They can just generally prevent suicide. So we're trying to take a preventative approach with this. The reason being that if we just keep focusing on risk, then we forget how resilience can be built. And if we keep focusing on risk, sometimes we're acting as if we're preventing suicide thoughts altogether. That's not really realistic. A lot of people, period, and especially in the ADHD community, actually have suicidal thoughts. And so how can we take that and help them be resilient with those thoughts? So it considers the context that they're living in, and it makes it more of a realistic conversation. Plus, it's just a happier, positive, more strengths-based conversation to have. So what happens with suicide conversations that are actually somewhat positive? That's kind of hard to even think about. How can we, as people who care about members of the ADHD community, how can we format or formulate these conversations? And one of the ways that we can do that is by using a tool called SHORES. So SHORES is a mnemonic with the purpose of helping you remember each one of these elements. And so we have this visual here of the lighthouse where there's a shore that this is shining light onto. If you can begin to imagine or create a story around this mnemonic, then it's going to sit with you and it's going to stick with you a little bit longer. So we'll invite you to do that next. In the SHORES mnemonic, there are each letter represents a specific element, which is a suicide protective factor that has been verified in the academic literature, something that protects against suicide. So what we have to remember is there could, just like I was saying earlier, there could be so much risk, right? That when by the time they get to you or mention it to you, there's going to be so much risk that the protective factors really can't operate very well anymore. We're trying to head that off by having protective factors conversations early on. The way to do that is to focus on each one of these protective factors in the mnemonic. The first one is the first S, which is skills and strategies to cope. And so as we go through each one of these things, we'll explain what the letter means, but also what it looks like in an ADHD context. So skills and strategies for coping, no matter who you are primarily emotional regulation, which might be challenging for people in the ADHD community, adaptive thinking, same. But engaging in interests is also highly valuable and successful for coping. So there's ways that we can do this as people who are supporting those with ADHD. One is to think back on the fact that many people with ADHD have experienced multiple criticisms compounding over their lives. So when we talk with them, we might say something like, when things have seemed at their worst, what do you do that helps? So we're not always inserting skills and strategies to cope into the conversation as much as we're welcoming or inviting them in, because often that is enough to prompt a memory like, well, there was this one time that I tried this thing and it seemed to help. So asking, what do you do that seems to help when things are looking really, really bad? Also to consider ways that they might think differently about options. And then emotional regulation. Is there a way that we could, help them breathe better? Like, it's okay, I'm here with you. If it's a child, that's particularly helpful to know if they made a bad grade or they didn't get picked for the team, to help to regulate those emotions in the moment. Even if they're angry, that's okay, but we want to help them regulate. It also might look like literally accepting them just as they are, which I know sounds simple, but they're not getting it. And so encouraging them to do the same, to accept themselves as they are. to support them engaging their hobbies. So of these 3 skills and strategies to cope that the literature says work for everybody, this is the one where, it's a superpower for people in the ADHD community to engage in one's interests and hobbies. And so when they're in a tough situation, to be able to encourage them to engage in that, join with them, do it with them, but do it their way. And then also, I would want to point out that this is literally what ADHD coaching is about. So ADHD coaching encompasses many, many processes, but particularly hones in on what are the skills and the strategies that people with ADHD can use to cope in a neurotypical world. And so this is a great time for family members, colleagues, whoever you are in relationship to someone with ADHD, to refer them to a great skills coach. The next letter in the mnemonic is H, for hope. So we know that hopelessness is a suicide risk factor. So let's flip this and let's talk about how hope can protect people from suicide. It does that by really offsetting negative emotions, not just hopelessness, but feeling stuck in the moment, feeling very angry, feeling rejected. So things that people in the ADHD community might be more prone to feel. And so when we kind of increase hope with our partner, with our kids that have ADHD, we're also encouraging them to not feel like a burden, not feel like they don't belong. There's all types of ways that hope can counteract negative feelings and it actually increase positive feelings. So this might sound something like, what do you still believe could be possible that actually keeps you hopeful? What do you do that, even if it's just for a quick moment, it makes you feel hopeful? So recognizing that even just a small amount of time, if hope can be increased there, that's great. And just remember, it's not your hope, right? For them, it's their hope. So you're sort of following their lead with this. And this especially might look like daydreaming with them, right? Visioning with them, going into their world and understanding where the hope comes. And then also to share positive narratives of people with ADHD. And so Elle shared the statistics earlier that so many of our major business leaders, for instance, are people with ADHD. How have they done that? How have they harnessed their superpowers? And even to help the person that you love remember their own success stories, their own success moments that you might be able to bring to memory more easily than they would. So focusing on not necessarily like the how do we get to this big dream, because that's not important necessarily for increasing hope, but focusing on what the dream is and how it feels to dream that way. The next part in the mnemonic is the O. This is objections to suicide. So we know that people who have moral or cultural objections to suicide tend not to attempt suicide as much. This varies by religions, it varies by culture. I feel it's more important to understand what those objectives are than to necessarily like increase them per se, because in reality, sometimes objections to suicide can eventually have people feel shunned from a community if they feel, for instance, that just this thought that has popped into their mind is actually sinful. And so now they don't know who to go to in this community to talk to about that. And so to say and recognize and accept the person that you're speaking with, to say, do you ever feel like, not that you're a terrible person for thinking it, but that suicide is just the wrong idea for you right now? And then if so, why? Why is it not right for you? So you're understanding their objections, which may have some cultural and moral elements to them. And if this is true for you, to remind them, I don't want you to end your life, not because of these moral objections per se, right? But because I simply care about you. I care about you because I want you to be here with me. I care about you because I value life and I believe that's what we're supposed to do. Maybe it's we in this religious community. And so I don't want to judge you for thinking about suicide, and I don't want you to think about suicide. I want you to know that I'm here when you want to talk about it. I'm someone you can come to. Even if I might believe that it's wrong, I'm someone that I believe that you can come to. So this is one of the ways that we can talk about it in a flexible way that says, I may object to suicide, but I'm not literally rejecting you by doing so. The next one is R, and this actually stands for two things. So my apologies, but you're going to have to remember two elements for R. That means that shores is really shores with two R's. And the first R is reasons for living. So we know that when people have literal specific reasons to live that they have identified, that keeps them from attempting suicide. It's just what it sounds like. It's motivation, it's motives to stay alive when you consider killing yourself. And some of these things are, that's why we put this adorable puppy here. I love this pic that you found, Elle. So he's like totally zenned out. I might want to stay alive because I'm completely in love with my dog and I would be worried what would happen to him if I'm gone. So it's real concrete. Talking with someone that you know and care about who is in the ADHD community about what keeps you here, right? And it could be people, it could be pets, it could be a responsibility that you hold. It could be something that's like a meaning that you hold in life or something that you are looking forward to in the future. And I'm wanting to live until that time. And so that might sound like you saying to them, every day we choose life. So what's kept you living? Why are you here today? It might look like you talking about, oh my gosh, that sounds wonderful. When is that going to happen? I'm looking forward to it too. What do you love most about that? So you're really heightening that reason, not just being like, oh yeah, you've got some reasons, but why? What is that? How does that make you feel? And then also it might look like just reminding them of those things, that might be something that they haven't remembered. And so you're going to bring that back into their memory. And to highlight their superpowers again, that's something that they may have forgotten. So you having these superpowers is what helps you to be able to do this job you love, or to hyper focused on this particular project, or to give love to the dog in the best way you know how. And then also to remove barriers from doing these things that they love the most, from whatever those reasons to live are. The second R is the restriction of means. And so we know that when we can forever or temporarily remove means, restrict means, or just distance or alter people's access to the means that they would use to attempt suicide, that it reduces suicide risk. And so we're protecting them in that way. It can be large scale reduction projects. So if you want to be involved in advocacy at that level, that's fantastic. But you can also learn how to have one-on-one conversations with folks. I'll give you some ideas here. And then there's also something that's called CALM training, which is counseling for lethal means. But if you're just wanting to have a conversation with someone you love in the ADHD community, this might sound like, it sounds like there have been terrible times in the past and there might be some in the future. So let's plan out, if another terrible time hits you, what can we do right now to make it harder for you to kill yourself that way later? So you're planning with them. It's totally collaborative. And it may be like, for a temporary period of time, this thing that they might do is no longer, they're no longer able to access. So you're distancing them. You're not removing it altogether. Or you can, obviously, and particularly if it's a child. And you can also recruit others to help with this process, right? So if you're a teacher or a counselor and you want to help a child or not a child, you can work with a family member as long as that person has given you the okay to talk to them. So I want to pause here sort of in the middle of these and see, Al, as we've zoomed through some of the elements of the mnemonic, are there things that you want to highlight that I've missed?
Every time I hear you present these slides, it's so soothing to hear as an ADHD person, that kind of acceptance and support. I can only imagine what it would feel like if someone in our community was hearing that from a close loved one, or in these situations. Two things that I want to highlight. I absolutely love that your model here emphasizes asking questions and working with the ADHD person. It's very difficult to tell an ADHD person how to do something, including any tools to use, because of our interest-driven brain. It means that only the tools that resonate will work for us. And of course, only we can determine what resonates. So that's such a great approach. It's wonderful. And the second thing, as far as hope goes, I have to say in my ADHD journey, just realizing what was completely normal for us was honestly one of the best things that's happened in my life. And it really helps to quiet a lot of the negativity. Two groups that I highly recommend for ADHD folks are CHAD, which is a group that has support groups of all different ages, different, people in different spaces in life that are incredibly, incredibly helpful. And also Attitude, it's ADD. I know it doesn't exist, but Attitude magazine, and there are wonderful resources in that. They also have support groups and other things that would be great to get into. Oh, and one last thing, I would note that the global conference, the annual global conference on ADHD is happening in November in Texas. So just in case anyone really wants to get into the topic.
That is awesome. Thank you so much. Now I've lost what I was doing to try to get those things into the slides. One moment. Okay. Yeah, I'm glad to hear you highlight that. I do think that's important. Like counselors and other kind of professionals are definitely trained to ask questions and be open to things. And sometimes we forget, especially when we're talking about suicide, like for some reason, we just shift our minds and start being more directive and more active. And we need to be, because it may be literally a crisis situation, but all of us, regardless of what our role is, professional, non-professional, when someone is in an emotional crisis, or just really, really overwhelmed by how negative the world around them is about them just being themselves, every chance we get to let them guide the conversation, or at least choose, I'm thinking of younger children, choosing like, which one of these two ways would you like for it to go, is so much more comforting, because we can feel more heard and also more in control. And a lot of times that really changes how we feel, particularly with the person that's trying to help us. So I know when we can get freaked out as helpers and just want to help, and often we have to kind of calm down and allow the other person to really guide us. So we'll move on to the next thing, because I already kind of am. So the next letter is E. This stands for engaged care. I'm particularly talking about professionals here. So absolutely, if you happen to be a mental health professional, then this is a time for you to, when there's clear suicide risk with a person in the ADHD community or anyone else, it's time for you to up your care, right? To make maybe follow-ups, to do additional outreach. But even if you're not serving in a professional role with someone and you are really wanting to make sure that they are receiving care, that could be mental health care, but it also could be non-mental health care. And so research has shown that when all different types of professional care are provided, that actually decreases suicide risk. So this could look like, if you're wanting to be helpful, helping people literally find and schedule providers. We all know how hard that is sometimes, right? So let's look at this insurance list. Let's see who's available. Let's look at the free resources in the community. And I'll make a point here. Let's make sure that those people are informed on ADHD. Let's make sure that the people that we find are informed on suicide, and to model how to advocate for that, how to ask those questions if you're working with an adult. And also to just ask how care is going, right? To check in with your colleague that you're helping, to ask your aunt that you've been concerned about, how's the care going? And then to advocate for more responsive care. So the E is an important part of this. It's not just care. I went to the doctor once this year. It's engaged care, which means both like literally the amount, right? But also the emotional engagement that the person has. So many ways in which we can help people with that. The last element of SHORES is support. That's S. We here are looking less at professional support and more at personal support. So these are supportive environments, supportive relationships. So you just trying to follow SHORES in a conversation with your family member or your friend is already providing some support. And it also includes social activities beyond you. It really helps people to counter the isolation they might feel, or the suicidal ideation they might feel because they're high stress. So this could work in a workplace as well. And it may sound like you asking who has supported you in life, even if you don't get to connect with them very often. Who's somebody that gives you support? For you, asking about you. How can I be there for you when things are tough? And remember that this might not sound, you got to follow what they say, right? So it may be something like that we might anticipate. Well, anytime I need to cry on the shoulder, your shoulder's available. It could be something like that, right? But it also could be like, you're the best person I know to laugh at stupid stuff, or you always get my humor. That's what I love about you. Or I know that I can always count on you to go windsurfing with. That was a random hobby I just pulled out of the air. But anyway, some kind of hobby that the person loves. And there's no talk about emotions and how I'm doing and feeling. That's fine. Now you know how they value you being there for them. And the same thing can be true with kids, that they say, you watch TV with me and I like that. Okay, now you know. And it also may look like you setting up calls with family, with these supportive family members, or throwing an event, right, for a kid. It might be modeling what it can look like to be a good friend, or a good uncle, or a good neighbor, or a good coworker, particularly for someone who's been struggling with that, with doing that, to model what that looks like. And then also you learning how to be an ally to the ADHD community. That is going to go really, really far. And then of course you can go and you can teach that and share that with others so that we can continue to grow this community. So like I said, we kind of focus this not necessarily toward a professional audience, but there's Shores was created for a professional audience, for clinical and other counselors. So if you are in that group, whether you are a health professional, a primary health professional, or an allied health professional, you can use Shores in suicide assessment. You can integrate it into your safety planning. You can do it as crisis response or as long-term management, and you can do it as psychoeducation. Shores is something that I can literally use with myself and do. So you can teach people and train people that way. You could do it as a classroom guidance lesson if you're a school counselor. So many ways that Shores might fit across your life and your work.
So the main takeaways that we're hoping that you will walk away from this with are that ADHD is a difference in brain wiring. It has significant strengths, but it also has an increased risk for suicidal ideation or activity. There are some challenges that come with trying to fit into a neurotypical world when you're ADHD, and I like to put it that way because I'm not saying where that's coming from, but just challenges. That the medication does have a significant protective side to it, and so I don't advocate for or against medication for anyone, but just something to take into consideration. And then some ways that you can engage in prevention. And I honestly have to tell you that Jenny's Shores model is it's so spot on for someone in our community. So I absolutely love that. So we do have some time left for, if I can get my slide to work, for questions. Here's our contact information. If Jenny or I can be of further help, please reach out. Absolutely. There's also a link in the chat and on this slide for a feedback survey. If you want to fill that out, at the end, you'll get a link to a multi-page resource list that's I've been growing since forever, and also some links to how you can continue the conversation with us. I'd love to answer any and all questions, and I'm sure Jenny would too. So feel free to just shout out, or if we have any in the chat, that's great too.
I'm just going to jump in here real quick. I want to first say thank you both for this wonderful presentation. It was very informative, very interesting. I've also posted a few things in the chat. We have a feedback form as well. It's a separate one. And then we also have a resources link. These are resources that presenters sent us. So that might make it easier for you to get notes on any of the presentations that you saw during the symposium and enjoyed.
Randy, we stepped on your toes. And the handout we made for this presentation is additional information in addition to that resource list. So thank you so much.
Oh, sure, absolutely.
So what do y'all want to know?
And feel free to put it in the chat or just jump out. There are not that many of us, so we can just have a conversation. I'm also kind of curious what, if anything, especially resonated with any of you all who were listening. I'd love to know that too.
I
Hi
wanna say-
there.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. I recently had a friend that has ADHD and other things, and they had a were in a very low point, and these strategies I kind of recognized, and that they have had that before. So they had their plans, and they had like a friend that they had to call if they like thought about it. They had to call this person before they did anything, and so they were able to make a like coffee date with them later on, and that was literally what got through them, because we couldn't go and like pick them up and take them anywhere because they had COVID, but it was like at least they had that in the future, like so many days from now. You have that to look forward to. You have to make it to that at least. So it was like, so hearing everything was definitely kind of hitting home, and I'm glad that they had that. But in hearing that like professionals also do it, it's like, oh yes, it all fits.
I'm curious how your friend reacted to that kind of support.
That's what got them through it.
Mm.
That's what, and so once they were free of quarantine, we've been making sure we made more plans, and just because they were in just a terrible, like they had a lot going on at the same time, and home life was a wreck, and so I kept inviting them over and letting them vent, and so they definitely made progress kind of on their own, but luckily with that support, and I think all of us showing that we were supportive helped. And just like, we still love you, you're still here, we want you here tomorrow. Like, so it's calmed down now, but I know every so often like they've had troubles, like they just hit a low, and so I was hoping to, and I'm feel more refreshed about the subject. That's why I'm here.
That's beautiful. I'm thankful to you for what you and others did for them. I mean, that's huge. And you also bring up a good point that sometimes these reasons for live are like a temporary thing, and that in her case, it was the reason to live was coffee date next week or whatever. It doesn't have to be like, something that's forever.
Yeah, they because they used to have cats, and this was the first time that they did not have an animal in the home. So it's not like you could use something like the animal, so we had to go for the short-term stuff. But
well, and too, like a reminder that and that coffee date doesn't have to turn into a whole bunch of emotional conversation. If that's not what they're up for at that time, and ring in that, that just might not literally be where their emotions are in the moment, to just meet them where they are literally in that present moment.
Yeah, we've definitely came across that where and I'm known as like the one that distracts people from like the terrible situations. I'm the one with the gallows humor that makes the terrible jokes, or just completely like, let's talk about random things. So it was I don't get to get into the weeds very often with my friends, because I'll have something else, but I'm definitely known as like distraction. But that I feel bad that I can't get, like, the other friend had to be the one who was like, let's do the coffee date, and then I was like the follow-up.
Yeah, we're tag teaming.
Oh, that's great. And Megan, you just jogged my memory as well. One thing I probably should have mentioned is one of the significant comorbidities with ADHD is insomnia and sleep disturbances. And of course, that can be a huge contributor when it comes to emotional dysregulation and just all sorts of things. I would say, at least in my experience, the vast majority of primary care physicians and even psychiatrists do not know that there's a link between those, but there is much that can be done there. So also, if you know anyone who's facing this, who has ADHD, it's a good question to ask, like, how are you sleeping?
Yeah, I think they hit a like it's 6 o'clock, I'm going to bed now. And
Mhm.
so it was that fine line of like, okay, when are you actually sleeping, or are you just kind of sequestering yourself away, and we actually should be checking up on you? Like that was also like a double-edged sword that popped up. So that's, yeah. But the sleep thing, yes, for sure. I know they've definitely the sleep of dead sometimes to like get away from it. So I'll definitely ask that next time. How have you been sleeping? That's a good one.
Yeah, and I think unfortunately a lot of medical doctors may not also always remember that lack of sleep, no matter why the lack of sleep is occurring, is literally on a neurobiological level a risk factor for suicide. So
Mhm.
any way that people can get more sleep is better to regulate that.
Absolutely.
Perfect.
Max, I understand it's 5 a.m. Perhaps you don't want to shout from the rooftops, but thank you so much for your contribution in the chat. For anyone who didn't see it, Max says that part of the presentation, receiving so much criticism, resonated a lot with me, that we have a very strong inner critic, which sometimes needs professional help and practical tools. Absolutely. I have not met anyone in our community yet who that has not resonated for. And honestly, it starts for most people, from parents, who very well-meaning parents who just cannot understand why your room is such a mess. And then that times the rest of your life. So yeah, getting, like, as Jenny's model, one of the reasons I really love it is because it is strengths-based approach. And that's just so critical to recognize and continually remind ADHD folks about their strengths, their skills, and their talents.
Is it possible for you to talk just a little bit about bullying, especially in middle school and high school? I know children who have ADHD have had suicidal attempts, and their friends, well, I should say the people they go to school with not only won't let them forget, but they will say things like, "Oh, you're still alive. Well, didn't you take your meds and are you gone now?" I mean, the bullying is horrendous. And so when you have somebody with ADHD that is really doing the work and getting healthy and being proud of themselves, and then they hear these comments every day at school, it's kind of impossible.
You're bringing up such a good point, Debbie. I'm going to speak quickly to ADHD and bullying, and then I'll let Jenny take as far as the relationship to suicide. But ADHD has a significant impact on the speed at which our brain develops and matures, and how we're able to connect to our peers. Our brains tend to mature up to 10 years more slowly than neurotypical folks. So for instance, whereas neurotypical folks, their brains are pretty much moved from jello to solid by 25, ours can go into our 30s, even our mid to late 30s. And so sometimes that impacts how we relate to peers. One of the very common things that ADHD kids hear is, "You're weird," because we do have these like crazy outside of the box, thoughts that kids have trouble really connecting to. And so bullying is really, really common, frankly, for anyone who's in the neurodiverse community, but also for ADHD. I highly recommend a book called Why Won't Anyone Play With Me? It is it's probably the #1 book for understanding how you can help children who are ADHD and facing social problems.
Yeah. We unfortunately know that, I mean, not only does increased bullying, no matter what the bullying is about, increase suicide risk, and then you're highlighting now that there's literally a circular motion to this, that the suicide attempt can be used to bully. There's a couple of things that are coming to my mind, and I would say do the surest thing, right, with the individual, but I'm honestly thinking way more on a systemic level now. And that is, there are procedures and processes that school counselors and teachers can use for that return to school transition after a suicide attempt, and they may not know about them. And so if you literally have school professionals who need to hear that, I can go look and find those. Something else is advocating for there to be, there's anti-bullying prevention programs, and then there's suicide prevention programs. And what we find from those is particularly related to suicide prevention programs, when there's a peer component, when it's literally the students are trained on how to do suicide prevention with their own peers, that not only works better for decreasing suicide risk at the school level, but also, what do you know, bullying drops and other behavioral problems drop. And so I'm putting a couple of these in the chat. The two that are the most well-known and the most well-supported. Oops, I hope I got the right. Oop. Give me just 1 second. That's one of them. Here's the other. One of them is Sources of Strength, and the other is Hope Squad. So if people are in a position to advocate to school counselors, school administration, district level administration for either one of these things, it can really, really make a difference. And then that way the context that they're going into is altered. Yeah.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Yeah.
Jenny, you just jogged my memory. One other thing is, as opposed to autism or some other neurodivergence, ADHD is not understood nearly as well by schools, and it is extremely common for schools to say that if it's not impacting academic achievement, then they will not give services to any to ADHD children. I've actually had that said to me about one of my own children. So advocating as well for your child's own needs and understanding that many ADHD kids are highly intelligent and they are people pleasers, so they will focus a lot of their energy on masking, and teachers will not see truly what's going on. So advocating also for the schools to take it seriously and provide help is critical.
Questions or not questions, comments, concerns?
And it's okay if you just want to know the name of the paint color behind Jenny, because I've been staring at it too. Lovely.
It changes all throughout the day too.
All right, well, I see that we're right at 8:30. Thank you all. I know, or for us, Max, it's like God only knows the time, but thank you all so much for joining us. We really appreciate your attention, especially as it goes into later in the night. And Jenny, do you want to give us some final thoughts on what perhaps we can take away from this?
Yes, I'm just happy that everyone wanted to hear a positive conversation about two things that really get a negative rap. I don't feel like this is Pollyanna, right? I feel like this, I don't feel like we're what is it called? Something positivity, where we're
Toxic positivity.
Yes, toxic positive. This isn't toxic positivity talk, right? This is literally acknowledging what are the innate strengths that people in the ADHD community have, that there is a community, that they are not alone, that you are not alone, and that there are allies as well, both personal and professional allies, who want to support, and particularly when it comes to suicide risk. And so I just want to remind you, you don't have to know that there's suicide risks to have these conversations. You can have these conversations as part of your everyday, regular life with these people in your communities, because it's all based on wellness. And that's exactly where we found this information on wellness and root it in wellness. So I'm grateful to be partnered with Elle to be able to give this kind of information that targets it and makes it practical for you to use. And we also welcome your feedback in using it. Please reach out to us and let us know.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
You have a great night.
Thanks, Randy.